I never thought a piece of paper could feel like a slap across the face. The HOA taped a neon notice to my garage, smug as if they owned me. But one deed from 1924 and my aunt at the clerk's desk turned their prized gatehouse into a historic district overnight. Let me take you back. The notice was impossible to miss. A sheet of neon orange glared against the pale beige of my garage door, the tape snapping in the warm breeze like a flag of shame. I stood in the driveway longer than I should have, eyes tracing the bold black letters. Notice of violation. SEC. 4.3. Exterior surfaces. My name scrawled under the header looked foreign there, as though I'd suddenly become a stranger to my own house. The smell of barbecued ribs drifted from 2 yards over, mingling with laughter and the clink of ice in plastic cups. Neighbors lingered near their folding chairs, pretending not to watch me, their glances sliding off like water on wax. I tugged the paper free, the tape tugging back sticky strands, catching my fingers. For a second, I thought of keeping it pristine as evidence, but the humiliation boiled up faster than reason. I crumpled it hard in my palm. The paper crackled louder than the cicadas. On the wall inside my garage hung an old paint scraper. The wooden handle was smooth from my father's hand, the blade dulled from years of use. He'd kept every tool sharp, every surface neat. Looking at it now, I felt both grounded and exposed, like he was watching to see whether I'd measure up. I didn't get the chance to retreat. Randall Price strolled up the driveway, white polo tucked tight into Khaki's HOA badge pinned to his chest as if the world needed reminding. He carried a glass of iced tea and the smug look of a man who never spilled a drop. "Rule's a rule," he said, eyes on the bright square where the notice had been taped. "Garage doors peeling. You've got 10 days. I forced myself to breathe through my nose to answer slow. The door's solid. A little weathering doesn't justify this. My voice sounded steadier than my gut felt. Across the street, someone laughed at a joke too loudly, the timing suspicious. A boy chasing a frisbee stopped short to stare at me before his mother pulled him back. The Saturday sun suddenly felt heavier. Randall sipped his tea. 10 days, he repeated like a judge issuing sentence. Or we escalate. The crumpled paper sweated in my hand. I wanted to flatten it out smooth, the wrinkles pretend this was just a misunderstanding. Instead, I slid it into my back pocket, the edges sharp against my skin. Neighbors began shifting closer as though drawn by scent. One of them, Bill from 2 doors down, tilted his beer can toward me. "Guess the old guy can't afford paint," he said loud enough for his lawn chairs to snicker. The laughter caught like kindling, spreading from yard to yard until it filled the cul-de-sac. My cheeks burned hotter than the grill smoke. I thought about my retirement account, about how every dollar had a job, none of which included repainting a perfectly good door. I thought about my father, about how he'd scraped paint himself rather than bend to someone else's timetable. The scraper hung silent in the garage, a relic and a dare. I met Randall's eyes. His were cool, calculating. He leaned in so close I could smell the mint on his breath. "Or we fine you out of this block," he whispered, tone casual as if he were discussing the weather. The laughter dimmed behind us, but the words hung heavier than any joke. I kept my arms folded, not giving him the satisfaction of a flinch. Inside, though, the first crack had formed a reminder that even after decades of doing things right, a man could be shamed with a piece of paper and a neighbor's grin. The certified letter arrived the following Friday, the kind of envelope that makes your stomach tense before you even touch it. It was cream-colored and stiff. My name, machine-printed a red stamp in the corner, shouting, "Certified," like a siren. The edge nicked the pad of my thumb when I slid it free, and a thin line of blood bloomed as if to underline the point. Inside, formal phrases that marched down the page, bolded section numbers, and the sentence that bit the hardest. Failure to comply within 10 days will result in further action pursuant to bylaws Circumter 4.3 and Circumter 7.2. I read it twice. Then a third time, the words growing heavier, not clearer. Outside, the late September wind shivered the maple leaves. The old gatehouse at the neighborhood entrance watched every car with its cracked brick and peeling trim, a monument to authority that hadn't earned it. A week later, I sat 2 rows from the front in the HOA clubhouse. Fluorescent lights hummed like tired bees. Metal folding chairs made their familiar complaints against the linoleum as neighbors settled in, shaking off rain from their jackets, cups of burned coffee steaming into the stale air. A printed agenda lay on each chair. Mine read in neat bullet points, "Violation Review, Exterior Standards." Under it, my lot number glared like an accusation. Randall Price took his place at the card table up front, flanked by 2 board members in the matching navy sweaters. He tapped a pen against the tabletop and called the meeting to order. His smile held for the room, not for me. Before we get to landscaping, he said we'll address a pressing matter of community aesthetics. A few heads turned my way. The woman behind me sucked her teeth. Someone else whispered, "Finally." He gestured toward a corkboard where an 8x10 photo of my garage door had been pinned, sun-faded but intact, the paint a weathered almond. "You can see the condition," he said, and let the silence do its work. A man near the wall chuckled. "Eyesore," he stage whispered. I rose and smoothed the agenda with my palm. "The door is structurally sound," I said. "It seals properly. There's no rot. I've maintained it myself." My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. I cleared my throat. "Your own standards refer to condition, not just color." Randall's smirk made an appearance. He enjoyed the theater of letting the room answer for him. Someone coughed and a chair scraped. A woman I'd seen at the pool committee tilted her head. "It brings down the look," she said. "It's an eyesore," Randall concluded as if translating her thought into law. One board member nodded immediately, the other after a glance at Randall's pen. I tried again, slower. Bylaws, Circumference 4.3 refers to exterior surfaces maintained in good repair. "I'm happy to do so, but a repaint this season isn't necessary to keep the door in repair. It's—" I searched for the least inflammatory word cosmetic. A murmur rose. The man by the wall laughed outright. "Maybe he doesn't belong here if he can't follow simple rules." Heat crept up the back of my neck and collected under my collar. The fluorescent hum seemed louder. I looked down at my hands. The bandage I'd wrapped over my thumb from the envelope nick was dirty at the edges. I pressed it flat. A board member cleared his throat and read from a sheet. Per sec. 4.3 and sec. 7.2. The homeowner was notified of non-compliance and given 10 days to remedy. Non-compliance remains. I shook my head. "You mailed the letter with 5 days already gone. I received it last Friday." I opened the folder. I'd brought a copy of the notice, postmarked, the tracking receipt stapled to the corner. Paper rasped softly in the room. "I'm asking for a reasonable extension. I'll scrape and repaint before first frost." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The hum of the lights, the steady drip of the coat rack catching rain from someone's umbrella, the smell of coffee that had been reheated one time too many. I thought about my father showing me how to feather an edge with a steady wrist, the scraper handle warm from his palm. Randall leaned back and folded his arms. "If we start granting exceptions," he said, "we lose cohesion. Property values are protected when standards are enforced consistently." A woman near the door, new to the neighborhood, I thought, whispered, "He works the system because he knows it." Her friend snorted. I held up the photo taken from the corkboard. Up close, it looked worse than in person. Flat light taken at an angle that emphasized the streaks. "Who took this?" I asked. "Doesn't matter," Randall said. "We all have eyes." "This meeting isn't a trial," one of the board members added, as if that comforted anyone. Another hand went up in the back, then fell without being called on. The room was deciding line by line what kind of place it wanted to be, and it seemed to prefer easy punishments to careful measurements. I tried again this time, keeping my gaze on the board, not the crowd. "Grant me until October 15th. I'll handle it myself. It won't cost the association a dime." There was a thin moment where I sensed the possibility of reason. One of the board members glanced at the calendar printed on the agenda, lips moving as he counted weekends. Randall caught the look and cut in. "Consistency," he said, and slid a new paper from a manila folder as if he'd been waiting for the cue. The certified letter was not a suggestion. He held it up, red stamp flashing under the fluorescence. The paper's corner curled toward me like a crooked finger. He let the room absorb the sight, then added, "We've also had reports," a pause for effect, "of additional non-conforming elements visible from the street." My stomach tightened. Such as Randall shrugged a performance of regret. Mailbox angle, garden edging height. "We're compiling a list." A ripple went through the chair's, interest sharpened by the whiff of scandal. It didn't matter whether those things were real or useful. The point was pressure. I felt the room tilt away from me another degree. "You can take it up on appeal," one board member offered, not unkindly. He sounded as tired as the lights. "There's a form." The chair beside me creaked when I sat down again. I slid the agenda under my folder palms, damp. Across the aisle, a neighbor pulled out her phone and, with the smallest of smiles, took a picture of me looking down. "For the record, I suppose." Randall laid the certified letter on the table and flattened it with 2 fingers. In the interest of expediency, he said, "We'll move to next steps." He didn't need to read it, but he did anyway, savoring each clause. Notice of violation. Failure to comply. Notice of intent. The legalese puddled in the air like oil on water. He tapped his pen twice like a gavel. "Let me be plain," he said, finally raising his voice enough that the back row stopped whispering. "Fail again, we lien your house." The words clicked into place with the precision of a lock, and the room went very quiet. Somewhere outside, rain began again tapping the thin clubhouse windows as if to be let in. The garage held the winter like a box of ice. I sat on the bench with my coat still zipped, paging through zoning manuals I hadn't touched since retirement. The neon bulb above me buzzed and flickered, throwing tired light over the pegboard. My father's paint scraper hung on its hook, steady watching. Beside me lay the certified letter folded so sharply it looked carved. I turned pages with numb fingers. Easements, setbacks, overlays, dry language, but once familiar. My old notes lined the margins. Check county maps, plat year. Covenants, authority, ends. Reading them was like finding pieces of a map I'd drawn for another life. The phone vibrated on the bench. Lorraine's name lit the screen. My aunt had worked at the county clerk's office longer than I'd been paying taxes. Her voice carried calm. "Gid," she said, "let's grab coffee. I have an idea." The diner at Gull Lake leaned against the gray afternoon sign buzzing over puddles. Inside, coats steamed and the smell of burnt coffee drowned the air. Lorraine slid into the booth across from me, manila folder under her arm like contraband. A waitress with a tired smile filled our cups and left without a word. "You look cold," Lorraine said. "I am?" I admitted. She nudged the folder forward. I brought the right papers. The waitress set down 2 burgers wrapped in paper. Grease leaked through before we touched them. Lorraine flipped the folder open between the plates. Inside, plat maps, photocopies, a faded photo of the Gatehouse when its bricks still shone. That building, she said, tapping the photo, was never rezoned after the county replatted. The HOA covenants came later, but this parcel stayed civic, not association property. I studied the picture. The Gatehouse in its prime looked small stubborn, meaning their authority over it is weaker than they claim. If we push it bends. She layered a transparent sheet over a plat map. Borders refused to line up. "See that mismatch?" I nodded. The HOA's shading stopped just short of the Gatehouse lot. The county recognizes it. Associations run on perception more than deeds. She slid a pamphlet across. A line in small print caught my eye. "Properties of potential historic interest may be subject to interim protective measures. The historic district freeze," she said. "If we file for review, the county can halt alterations and enforcement tied to that structure. The HOA loses its stage." I scribbled notes in my pad. Grease from the burger smudged the ink, leaving streaks that looked like bruises. Gatehouse never rezoned. Historic freeze equal leverage. Lorraine sipped her coffee. "They think you'll tire out on their language, but you know how it works. Use it." I breathed out half laugh, half sigh. "I thought I left puzzles behind. You just started solving them for yourself," she said. The waitress refilled her cup. I covered mine with a hand that trembled more than I wanted her to see. Lorraine pulled out a list. "Get photos of the Gatehouse. Show its age, mortar plaque, roof sag. Bring your notices too. I'll check the deed index. If there's a gap, we widen it." I nodded, slid the list into my pocket. The folder closed with a soft snap, heavier than its weight. On the drive home, I passed the Gatehouse. Brick cracked like old pottery trim, flaking into curled chips. The bulletin board sagged with curling flyers, thumbtacks rusting. I parked and snapped photos close-ups of mortar seams that tarnished plaque the roofline. A car slowed, then moved on. I felt like I was photographing evidence at a crime scene. Back at my house, the sky had turned blue with evening. My mailbox held another envelope, the HOA logo stamped in black. The red word on top was smaller this time, but colder, final. Inside, the fine had climbed numbers typed with casual cruelty. I read it once then, again the digits growing heavier with each pass. I slipped the paper into Lorraine's folder where it belonged. The garage neon buzzed steady now. The paint scraper hung unchanged blade catching the light. Not much of a weapon, but I understood fights weren't always about swinging. Some were about standing long enough that the other side tripped over its own certainty. They showed up in a line, 4 inspectors with clipboards, Randall at the front like he was leading a parade. The July sun was merciless cicadas rattling in the trees, heat bouncing off the driveway. Neighbors drifted from porches and lawns, forming a loose ring. Some crossed their arms, others pretended to sip from plastic cups while keeping eyes on me. "Inspection," Randall said. He didn't need to. The clipboards were already scratching. One inspector crouched near the garage threshold, another stepped back with a camera. A third clicked a pen noting details I couldn't hear. Across the street, a woman lifted her phone, filming with the kind of half-guilt that made her glance down when I looked her way. "This door's sound," I told them. I reached into the garage and took my father's paint scraper from its hook. The handle was polished from his hand, the blade dulled, but true. I dragged it gently along the bottom panel of the garage door. No rot, no separation. Randall, closed in hand, extended. "Let me see." Before I could answer, he snatched the scraper. For a moment he weighed it like it might matter, then bent it sharply across his knee. The ping was small, but sharp like a bone snapping in a quiet room. He tossed it aside. It spun once on the driveway before lying twisted. A laugh slipped from somewhere in the crowd, nervous at first, then another followed. The phone across the street inched higher. Non-compliance, observed one inspector, muttered, scribbling. Another raised the camera for another shot, this time of the bent tool. The heat seemed to swell heavier on my shoulders. Randall smiled faintly. "We're here to help you meet standards, but standards don't bend." I bent to pick up the scraper. The handle was warm, the blade cocked at an angle it would never lose. My father's voice flickered through memory. "You can force until it breaks, or you can learn where it wants to move." Randall slid a document from his folder. "While we're here, a matter of record." He held up a letter stamped 2019 in thick type. "Notice of intent to file. Lien." He read aloud, savoring each clause. "Failure to comply. Authority pursuant to statute." The words oiled the air. Neighbors leaned in. One child whispered, "What's a lien?" His mother hushed him. "Transparency builds trust," Randall said. "You mean pressure," I replied. He shrugged. "Call it community standards." An inspector ripped a page from his pad and handed it over without meeting my eye. The paper was hot edges, limp from the sun. My shirt clung damp to my back. Someone whispered, "It's just paint," though the tone suggested everyone knew it wasn't. Randall tapped the notice with 2 fingers, deliberate. Evidence of progress within the week. Photos, acceptable date stamped. The woman filming shifted uncomfortably but kept her phone high. Another neighbor let out a thin laugh like air leaking from a tire. The inspectors folded their forms. Pens clicked. Clipboards snapped shut. The line turned neatly, following Randall back toward the gate. The crowd parted, closing again with murmurs. I stayed still, scraper in hand, bent neck, catching the light. Cicadas buzzed louder, filling the silence they left behind. From the sidewalk came a whisper not meant for me, but meant to travel. "They'll take his house next." The words stuck harder than the heat. I set the broken tool gently on the bench inside the garage. The door behind me stood weathered but solid. The sun hammered on indifferent while the neighbors drifted back to their yards with stories to carry. I unboxed the county maps on my kitchen table and spread them edge to edge like battle plans. The dim bulb over the sink hummed. Rain tapped the window with a patient finger. Lorraine's note sat on top of the stack in her blocky handwriting, Gatehouse 1924. Never rezoned. It felt less like a clue than a lever. I slid the oldest plat to the center and laid a newer one beside it. Streets shifted. Parcels fattened and trimmed like a town breathing. I traced the Gatehouse square on the 1920s, sheet-thin lines, neat script, then searched the subdivision map for the same shape. It wasn't where it ought to be. The HOA's shaded boundary ended a hair's width before the little square appeared again, floating like a stubborn island. I underlined pre-subdivision in my notebook and circled it twice. Ink bled into the paper where a coffee ring had already left its watermark. My fingers were stained gray by then, the way they used to get when I checked blueprints after a long meeting. Outside, tires hissed along wet asphalt. A neighbor's porch light cut a cone into the rain. I took the file folder of photographs and slid them across the table. The Gatehouse stared back in different weather and years, sunlit snowshot, always a little more tired. In one close-up, the mortar had crumbled to sugar. In another, the trim blistered into scales. A brass plaque near the door had letters that belonged to a different decade. I wrote dated plaques and wrought at sill on a sticky note and tucked it under the photo corner. The HOA letter from last week lay unopened near the salt shaker. I let it sit. It wasn't going anywhere, and panic spends itself faster when you feed it. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled the association's website. Minutes only go back so far when people like to forget, but PDFs remember more than they mean to. I downloaded a year's worth and started highlighting clauses that didn't match the bylaws they loved to quote. All announcements will be posted at the Gatehouse bulletin board and considered official notice. I highlighted it and wrote assumes ownership in the margin. Another line bragged about the new signage installed at the entrance without a permit number. Another thanked volunteers for historic-themed trim painted in a weekend. If the county froze the structure for review, all of that turned fragile. Their stage would be off-limits. Authority without a stage is just noise. Rain slowed. I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on and off small anchors of normal life. I printed the minutes and a parcel overlay Lorraine had emailed, then stood over the table and compared them under the lamp like a jeweler checking a setting. The overlay bared the Seam County Lot Here Association line there, between them, daylight. I took the old paper map and smoothed it with both hands. The paper was soft vellum thin at the creases. My father taught me to tape corners before cutting to respect anything old enough to have outlasted easy answers. The tape stuck, then bubbled from humidity. I pressed it flat with my palm and kept reading. The longer I worked, the less the room felt like a kitchen, and the more it felt like a shop. Coffee soured in a mug at my elbow. Pens migrated to the center like nails to a magnet. I built the argument one small piece at a time. Dates mismatches a photograph that could pass for evidence, a sentence in minutes that bragged too freely. A case, if not yet a victory. Near midnight, I stepped outside with my phone and took pictures of the garage door, not for them, for me. Beads of water braided down the panels, finding the grain and disappearing into it. The door looked tired, but loyal. When I came back in, I printed the last batch of minutes and stacked them, neatly slipping sticky flags at places I'd want to point to without hunting. Halfway through sorting, I hit a paragraph that tried to do too much. A board member had moved to recognize the Gatehouse as central to enforcement optics, then backed away from the language on a second reading, changing optics to communications. The track changes were visible in the PDF metadata someone had forgotten to flatten before uploading. I laughed, quiet and surprised, and put a star beside it. Optics. Sometimes people tell you everything if they think it sounds official. I rubbed my eyes and looked again at Lorraine's note. Never rezoned. It wasn't a promise, just a fulcrum. I whispered, not for drama, but to hear plain words in a quiet room, I've got them cornered. The sentence didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like clarity. I gathered the photos, slid them into plastic sleeves, clipped the minutes in order, and slipped everything into a manila envelope marked with the date. My hands shook with fatigue, not fear. Behind the window, the street lamp drew a small halo on the pavement. A cat jogged across belly low, uninterested in property lines. I left the HOA letter unopened. Tomorrow had a place for it. Tonight belonged to maps and the comforting ache of work that fit in my hands. I washed the coffee rings from the table and watched the drain swallow the brown current into its clean circle. In the garage, I flicked on the light and looked at the hook where my father's scraper had hung. The empty space felt like a missing tooth you can't stop tonguing. I taped a note there for myself. Fix handle. Some symbols are worth the repair. When I finally slept, paper shadows still ballooned from the table in the next room. Rain had stopped. The house clicked and settled. Morning found me at the sink with the window open to damp air. A truck door thumped outside. I wiped my hands, stepped to the driveway, and saw Randall by my garage standing with one foot on the curb like a man posing for an advertisement. He smoothed a fresh sheet against the panel with the flat of his palm, then pressed blue tape along the top edge as if framing a masterpiece. The letters were bold enough to shout without sound. Final notice. He glanced over his shoulder and met my eyes for a heartbeat, then lifted the last strip of tape and sealed the paper to my door. The tape snapped against paint that was still mine. The community hall had been warmed past reason, the kind of heat that makes coats smell like wet wool and old coffee. Folding chairs filled the room in tight rows. By the time I slipped into one along the aisle, the podium lights were already on, and Randall stood there smirking like a man about to open a show he'd written for himself. The microphone crackled, then steadied into a thin whine. Someone adjusted a knob, and the feedback nipped our ears. Order, Randall said, enjoying the sound of his voice magnified. We have a full agenda, but first a petition. There were murmurs at the word, a ripple that moved through the room as people leaned forward. A woman behind me whispered to her friend, and the sentence ended in the sharp click of a thermos lid. I could taste stale coffee on the air. It coated the tongue and wouldn't leave. Randall lifted a stapled packet. He didn't look at me. He looked at the room, looking at me. Petition to impose fines and initiate lien proceedings regarding lot. He read my lot number cleanly, like a man reciting a phone number from memory. Pens appeared. A few neighbors wrote it down like a recipe. He went on, whereas repeated notices have been ignored, whereas exterior standards remain unmet, whereas the association must protect property values. The clauses piled up blocky and certain. I felt them stack on my chest like cinder blocks. Point of order, a man near the wall said not unfriendly. Is the homeowner present? Randall let the pause do the work. He is, he said finally, and several heads swiveled. Some faces found the floor suddenly interested in scuffs on linoleum. Others met my eyes with a shrug that said, rules are rules, as if they hadn't been written by our neighbors 2 years earlier. The microphone crackled again. The association's secretary, a small woman with careful hair, rose and walked to the podium with a single sheet. As required, Randall said, stepping aside with a generous gesture. The secretary lifted the paper in both hands, her voice thin but clear. Summons, she read, and I knew then this wasn't just theater. You are hereby required to appear. She read the date and time, the room number at the county building, the case caption, the style of a language designed to leave no door ajar. My name sounded formal and distant in that mouth. A volunteer carried a copy down the aisle. I stood. My knees felt like dull hinges. When he placed it in my hand, the paper edge cut the pad of my palm, a precise, indifferent bite. I didn't flinch. I simply felt the damp warmth rise under the skin and spread beneath the bandage I would add later. The secretary continued, failure to appear may result in default judgment. The sentence trailed into microphone hiss and recovered as if embarrassed to be heard so clearly in a room full of people who used to wave to me when we both took out the trash. My hands shook not dramatically, just enough to make the summons feather at the corners. I folded it once, then twice buying time and finding none. A man I'd helped jump his car battery last winter stared at the floor. Another neighbor offered me a brief apologetic smile and then, guilty at his own kindness, looked away. Randall reclaimed the microphone. Non-compliance threatens our property values, he declared the sentence polished by rehearsal. It hung there with the heavy, flattering certainty of a slogan. Heads nodded. The room liked phrases that explained the world in 12 words. I raised my hand and he pretended not to see. I stood anyway. I've requested a reasonable extension, I said, keeping my voice even. I've maintained the door. I have documentation. The packet in my folder, a photograph, a receipt. Lorraine's notes suddenly felt like twine against a winch. Sir Randall said, switching to a tone that sounded like customer service, we all have to play by the same rules. It's not personal. That line had done a lot of work for a lot of people. A man in the back coughed and said, if we let one go, we'll have to let everyone go, and several chairs creaked in agreement. The secretary recorded something. I couldn't see her handwriting, but I imagined tidy letters marching into a neat, permanent line. The board's attorney, brought in for the occasion, leaned toward the mic and read a citation. His voice had the dry confidence of long practice. He lifted one clause from the bylaws, then another, and stitched them together with state statute. He didn't have to raise his voice. The sound system did it for him. I looked down at the summons again. The seal stamped at the top had left a slight emboss I could feel with my thumb, the county's crest pressing into my skin as if to test it for firmness. In the top margin, a clerk's initials sat small and precise. I imagined Lorraine's office, the dull hum of fluorescent lights, the endless patience of public record. I let the thought of her steady my breathing. We'll open the floor, Randall said, a parody of fairness. Hands went up. One neighbor asked whether lax enforcement would encourage slippage. Another wondered if the board could require a uniform color palette for doors and shutters. The attorney said, that's an interesting question, which meant yes. A young father near the aisle shifted his toddler from one knee to the other, not wanting to leave, not wanting to be here. The child reached for the microphone stand as the father pulled him back, the little hand grasping at amplified power. When it was my turn to speak, because he couldn't stop me forever, I kept it short. I will appear, I said, and the room accepted it like a weather report. And I will bring documentation. Someone snorted gently. A woman said, bless his heart, in a way that wasn't a blessing. Randall smiled without showing teeth. We appreciate your cooperation, he said, and moved the meeting on landscaping violations, a reminder about trash cans, a discussion of mailbox heights. Ordinary life resumed around the summons in my hand as if the paper were a coaster under a sweating cup. Every few minutes the microphone popped with a tiny explosion of feedback. Each time, people flinched, then laughed, then forgot to laugh. In between, the smell of coffee thickened. The attorney tucked his notes. The secretary stacked hers. A neighbor folded a handout into quarters and slid it into his pocket the way you might keep a ticket from a game you didn't enjoy. When it ended, people stood in clusters and practiced being normal. "See you next week? Let's hope the snow isn't as bad." The board members shook hands. Someone clapped Randall on the shoulder. He looked past me when he left the dais, but his reflection caught mine in the dark gloss of the exit door. I stepped outside. The night slapped me with winter air, thin and numbing. I walked to the end of the sidewalk, then turned back and looked at the hall's windows fogged with breath and heat. The summons paper was damp under my palm from sweat. I hadn't noticed the embossed seal, now a wet coin against my skin. "They think they've won," I whispered, more observation than vow. The words left my mouth in a white ribbon that dissolved before it reached the parking lot lights. I folded the summons once more, slid it into my coat, and started walking home through the sound of tires hissing on salted streets. The county building looked half awake at dawn, glass doors fogged from the night chill. Aunt Lorraine was already there, files clutched to her chest, coat collar turned up against the damp spring air. She didn't waste a word, just nodded toward the lobby doors the guard was unlocking. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed without mercy. A janitor pushed a mop in slow arcs, whistling a tune that bounced off tile. The records counter sat empty except for a clerk fighting a yawn behind thick glass. Lorraine flashed her county badge like a key and said, "Parcel index and plats for lot." She rattled off the numbers as if she'd rehearsed. The clerk blinked, then shuffled into the stacks. We waited in the hum. Lorraine set her folder down, tapping her nails in rhythm. "Today, we stop circling," she said. "Today, we file." The clerk returned with a gray archive box and a folder stamped with the county crest. Lorraine opened it carefully. The deed inside was crisp, the seal embossed so deep it cast tiny shadows. She tilted it so the crest glinted. "Predates the HOA charter," she said. "No rezoning since." I leaned closer. My thumb hovered over the raised seal, as if the weight pressed through the paper could steady me. The janitor's whistle slid into its course again, soft but sure. Next came the plat map, smelling of attic dust. Lorraine unrolled it across the counter. The Gatehouse parcel sat just outside the HOA overlay like a stubborn tile that wouldn't fit their puzzle. "They've built their authority on assumption," she said. "This proves it." The clerk slid over 2 forms. Application for Historic Preservation Review. Government font, unforgiving boxes. I picked up the pen. Questions read, describe property. Basis for potential significance. Known modifications. My handwriting scratched steady, original masonry plaque with 1924 date, continuous civic record. I attached Lorraine's photos, mortar crumbling, sagging trim, brass plaque dull with age. While I wrote, a man in a reflective vest came for a permit, then left humming. A woman argued about fence height. Life moved around us, ordinary, not knowing the floor was shifting. Lorraine read over my lines with one quick nod. "Understated works best," she said. The clerk pointed to the payment sign, exact change or card only. I slid my card across. The machine beeped cheerfully out of place in that gray room. She stamped the form with the heavy metal press. The thunk echoed like a gavel. She rotated the seal into the deed copy, the crest biting deep. I could feel it in my chest. She handed me a receipt. "Certified notice goes to the association today. Interim protections are in effect now." Lorraine smiled for the first time in weeks. "That's our freeze." I gathered the packet pages warm from the stamper. For a moment I thought of the broken scraper on my bench, bent at the neck. This paper, by contrast, pressed back. Some things break, some things hold. Lorraine touched my arm, rare and firm. "You've just flipped the board." The janitor punctuated it by banging his mop into the bucket. We both laughed quietly, the sound foreign and welcome. Outside, spring light broke through thinning clouds. On the curb, mail vans queued. Lorraine tilted her chin. "He'll have it in his hands before lunch." By afternoon, from my kitchen window, I watched the carrier tuck envelopes into the HOA's brass mailbox. Even at a distance, I knew one of them bore the green county label. I walked down the block. Through the clubhouse glass, Randall stood at the counter, silver letter opener flashing. He slit routine envelopes with casual speed. Then he reached the county envelope. His hand slowed. He peeled it open, carefully scanning the header. I saw his jaw tighten. He read once, then again. The color drained from his face by degrees like a photo bleaching in sunlight. A board member asked something beside him. He didn't answer. His palm pressed flat on the page as if to push the words back inside. I turned away before he looked up. The seal in my pocket pressed a round impression through my jacket, steady and certain. For the first time in years, my stride felt unhurried, mine again. By the time I reached the clubhouse, a new banner hung across the back wall, county seal stamped at both corners. Historic Preservation Hearing. The room looked almost the same. Folding chairs, scuffed linoleum, the faint smell of coffee that had boiled itself tired, but the banner changed the air. It said, without a raised voice, that the stage wasn't the HOA's anymore. The place was full. Neighbors crowded the rows and stood in the doorway, coats slung over arms, cheeks flushed from the first real bite of fall. Outside the glass, the Gatehouse sat within a low fence roped with autumn mums. A small bronze placard freshly set in the soil caught the afternoon light. Historic site, circa 1924. Someone had brushed the brick clean. For once it looked cared for, not used. I took a seat at a side table near the aisle. Before I sat, I lifted the paint scraper from my bag and set it on the tabletop. I'd straightened the blade, sanded the handle, rubbed in oil until the wood drank its fill. The metal still carried the faintest kink if you caught it from the side, like a healed bone you remember on rainy days. I ran a thumb along the handle and left it there, visible and quiet. Randall stood near the front with 2 board members. There was no podium for him today. The lectern belonged to a county official in a navy blazer who set a stack of files down with the small authority of paper that has already been stamped. Aunt Lorraine slipped in and found a seat in the second row, her smile not for show, just a small, steady light. The county official adjusted the microphone, no squeal this time, and called us to order. "This proceeding concerns the structure commonly called the Gatehouse," she said. Her tone was not warm, not cold. It was built to carry weight. The county has completed its review. Interim measures remain in effect until this decision is entered. A hush collected like dust motes in sun. Somewhere outside, a child shouted and was shushed by someone with a laugh still in it. She read the finding: the Gatehouse predated the HOA's charter, retained contributing features, and merited protection. As of today, she said, it is designated a local historic site. As such, any enforcement actions by private associations that rely on alterations to the structure or its appurtenances are void and must cease. She looked up, not at me, not at Randall, but at the room. Notices premised on such authority are invalid. The sentence landed softly and didn't bounce. It just stayed. A murmur moved from row to row, starting uncertain, then turning into small exhalations that sounded like belief remembering itself. Someone near the back clapped once, tentative. It spread hands, meeting palms a second at a time until the room found a rhythm, and the rhythm became applause. It wasn't loud so much as complete. Even the doors seemed to breathe easier. I felt Lorraine's eyes on me and turned. She nodded once as if to say, "There it is, hold still, and let it be true." The county official lifted a second sheet. The board is advised to audit prior fines and notices issued in reliance on the Gatehouse Bulletin as sole official posting. Future communications must comply with recorded covenants and applicable statutes. She paused. "We recommend an independent review." A board member coughed into his fist. Randall's face had the sickly gray of a screen when the projector loses its signal. He reached for a binder he didn't open, then for a water cup he didn't drink from. The county official thanked the room, made a final note, and drew a line at the bottom of her page with deliberate care. "This hearing is concluded," she said, and the small wooden gavel at her elbow scraped the lectern with a sound like permission. Neighbors turned to each other with quick math on their lips, fees they wouldn't be paying, notices that would become compost. A woman I barely knew touched my sleeve and said simply, "I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner." I said, "Me too," because forgiveness works both directions in small rooms. Randall cleared his throat as if to gather something that had fallen. He began, then stopped watching the county official pack her files. "We'll review." His voice wobbled in the space between those two words. He looked smaller without a microphone. A man from the third row stood and said, "I move that the HOA suspend collection efforts pending audit." Heads nodded. The motion didn't need theatrics, it needed hands. Hands rose, a field of them, and stayed. Someone counted aloud. The board didn't argue. Lorraine stood, and for the first time since we'd walked into a room together for this, she put a hand on my shoulder. "Go on," she whispered, as if I had something to do with the next beat. I lifted the scraper from the table and carried it with me to the aisle. I didn't climb anywhere or hold it up. I just waited for people to settle, then spoke into the busy air. "You tried to paint me out," I said, not aiming it at any one person. Then I looked at the window where the Gatehouse sat with its new placard and the mums at its feet. Now the Gatehouse paints you in history. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder, framed by a building that would outlast all of us. A few people laughed, the good kind that loosens a knot. Someone said, "Amen," not from church, but from relief. Randall stared at the floor, then at the bronze placard outside, then at his hands. He opened his mouth, closed it, and stepped down from the front with a neighbor's help he didn't acknowledge. The room didn't gloat. It adjusted the way a jacket settles on a shoulder when it's finally buttoned right. People began to drift to the doorway to see the placard up close. Voices softened in the parking lot as they read the dates aloud. Children pointed at the mums. One asked why the building got a special sign. Because it's important, his mother said, and her voice included more than brick. I gathered my folder, slid the scraper back into the bag, and turned to Lorraine. "Dinner," she said, as if we were late for it. "Your treat," I said, and she smiled. We hugged the kind of hug that knows its work and doesn't overstay it. On my way out, I paused at the placard. The bronze had picked up the day's last light. The Gatehouse looked almost pleased with itself, and I let it. Some things deserve to feel a little proud. I drove home with the window's cracked leaves scudding across the hood, the radio low so the evening could finish its sentence. The cul-de-sac was mostly empty, the hour when people decide whether to grill one last time or give in to leftovers. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment. The garage door faced west. The sunset laid a warm stripe across its panels, making the weathering look like memory instead of neglect. Inside, I slid the scraper onto the shelf above the bench. It rested there easily, the handle polished to a clean amber I hadn't seen in years. I touched the blade with the pad of my finger. Straight enough, strong enough. I left the light on a minute longer than I needed to, watching it take its old place. Out back, a few claps and a cheer floated thinly from the clubhouse, carried on the cool air. The sound arrived not like victory, but like permission. I turned off the garage light and the stripe of sunset narrowed, then went. The door clicked shut. The house settled. I stood in the quiet that finally belonged to itself and thought not loudly, home. The clubhouse feels lighter now, its gatehouse wearing a bronze historic site placard that gleams in the autumn sun. At home, I set the repaired scraper on the shelf, its handle smooth again, proof that what's bent can be made whole. Justice, I've learned, isn't thunder. It's steady hands and neighbors who finally see each other. Together, we cleared the fines, shared a meal, and promised to tend the old bricks like they tend us. Anyone staring at paper threats should know the law has corners you can lean on, but the real strength comes when a block leans together. How has your own street found healing after a fight?